This is Chapter 1, Part 4. Let's continue on looking at a number of graphs. As I've indicated before, I think the graphs provided by the textbook and also that I supplement from my own, from what I have, I think are really helpful because they really sort of boil down a lot of the information to some essential basic point. So let's rely on that here for the next few slides. You see here that according to this figure 1.3, that the estimated numbers in the United States of drug poisoning related emergency department or ED visits in 2015 involving heroin, opioids other than heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. So here we talked earlier in the lecture about the number of total overdose deaths. Here we're talking about visits to the emergency room and specifically how those are breaking down into sort of what's most common and what's least common. And you can see here now, and the data is a little bit dated here, 2015, but what I was interested in from this graph is just really to kind of stress that there are problems, drug poisonings with drugs other than those synthetic opioids like fentanyl that we talked about before. You can see in the section of this pie chart with lines, the pink section, you can see opioid drugs other than heroin. There we're talking about, see this graph has evidently excluded the synthetic drugs. Although I'm not 100% sure about that. It seems to be the case, but that's a little unclear. But nevertheless, that's the lab opioids are not our primary concern here. We want to show that heroin is the most common of these drugs listed that result in a visit to the emergency room. So opioids are particularly dangerous drugs, and also the naturally occurring ones, and the synthetic lab opioids are particularly dangerous. You can see that from the graph here. You can see, but those aren't the only ones which can be dangerous, because we see that 10% of the emergency room visits were due to drug poisoning with methamphetamines, and finally 6% due to cocaine, for a total of 9,401 visits to the emergency room. So again, what to take away from this graph is that currently in the news there's a lot of attention being paid to fentanyl, but there are other problematic drugs as well, and definitely those within the type that we would call opioids are particularly dangerous. And really, frankly, a lot of the reason why they're so dangerous is because they are the types of drugs that slow down the system, wind it down, lower the brain activity. And if they do so too much, if they're shutting down the system too much, they could completely shut down the system, resulting in the death of the individual. So this is why these drugs in particular are so dangerous. Moving to the next slide, you can see here drugs involved in the U.S. Overdose deaths. And here we have this addition of these sort of different types of drugs and the breakdown of the frequency of those. And we can see that the synthetic drugs, opioids, other than heroin or prescription opioid medications, while they didn't look particularly, like number one in 2015, you can see here that this chart goes up to 2017, and you see really after say 2012, an explosion of deaths involving synthetic opioids, and that very often is fentanyl. You can see that that has already rocketed way past heroin by about 2015, and well, I should say it passed it by around that time, but has skyrocketed since that time, and that has continued up to the present time. So, of course, this graph is several years, the end of this graph is several years old. So just extend these trends of all of them being up, but synthetic opioids in particular, where we have absolutely tens of thousands of people dying each year. And the synthetic opioids are contributing a great deal to these deaths, but also heroin, prescription opioid medications, so prescription drugs, not just street drugs. Those numbers are high as well. Cocaine is high. Methamphetamine is high as well. So those are your sort of your main types of drugs that are contributing to the overdose deaths. And the trends really are all up, and disturbingly so, especially for your synthetic opioids. Okay, next slide. Past year illicit drug use among people aged 12 or older in 2018. Now again, not the newest of data, but some data the patterns tend to stay the same or similar year to year to year. So those graphs we can use, not to show us the latest thing, but just show a pattern that pretty much persists over time. And of course, they're doing people age 12 and over because you don't get too many kids who are prepubescent using a lot of illegal drugs. And so they're focusing on the population, teenagers, and also adults who might be using illegal or illicit drugs. And you can see on the left is the pie chart that divides up those who've used in the past year versus those who haven't. And you can see that, and this, of course, this gives us big picture. This gives us perspective. If you're talking people who are 12 or over, so teenagers basically and adults, you can see that around 81% of this population have not used any sort of illegal drug, serious or minor, no drug of any sort over the past year. And that at the time of this survey, that would have been 220.6 million people not using, compared, if you look at the blue section, 53.2 million people, or 19.4% of the people 12 and over who use something in the past year. So you've got, you could roughly, if you kind of just want to keep it rough in your mind, and that's usually the way I test, is sort of a rough, level here. We could say roughly it's around 20% of people who are using something illegal during the past year, roughly 20%. And now the next bar chart to the right breaks down of those people who did use last year, in the year past, when they were, this is a survey, so they're asking people, what did you use in the past year? If you used, what did you use? And you can see that the vast majority of them, no surprise here, it really shouldn't be a surprise, is marijuana. And that's certainly the most frequent illegal drug that are used by Americans, whether they be teenagers or adults. So that just dominates. I mean, if you were to take all the other drugs and add them together, they might be in the neighborhood of marijuana, but that's clearly the most used drug. And when I say, I shouldn't even say illicit drug, because marijuana, of course, is becoming legalized in more and more states across the country. And so that has a little bit of a different legal status, quite a bit different legal status than some of these other categories. But the main story there's your most common drug. If somebody is using drugs, most likely using some kind of drug, most likely to be marijuana. Pain reliever misuse. So here we're talking about an RX, meaning prescription. So these are prescription drugs, not from some street dealer, originating from a doctor's prescription, that you have somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million people who are misusing, in other words, not using appropriately the prescription medication, pain relievers, taking too much, taking pain relievers that don't belong to them, that weren't prescribed to them, etc. So we're talking about 10 million there, a lot smaller than than marijuana use, but still pretty significant. Pretty significant. You got 10 million people is a serious number. If you look at prescribed tranquilizers or sedatives, meaning these are drugs that have the goal, the objective of calming someone, and relieving anxiety, making someone feel more peaceful, possibly helping people be able to sleep better and have better quality sleep. There you can see that there's in this particular year of 2018, over 6 million people misusing those prescribed drugs. So this has become a more common problem in recent years, is the misuse of drugs that come from a doctor, that come from a pharmacy, that have been prescribed by a doctor. This is more common than it used to be. We'll get into more of the details of that later on. Hallucinogens, 5.6 million. We'll talk about specifics down the road. Here, the purpose of this chapter is just to give you a big picture. Cocaine, 5.5 million. So again, this gives you a sense of the population of people, teenagers or adults, who are at least once a year trying these drugs. And you can see that it's a minority. It's clearly a fairly small percentage of the population. The country, the United States, is very big, and so at 5.5 million using cocaine, that's a small percentage, but in terms of absolute numbers, 5.5 million is a lot of people. So it kind of depends on how you look at it. Stimulant misuse, so this is prescription drugs, drugs that are designed to increase the activity of the system, to crank up a person's system. We can see that's around 5 million. Misusing those kind of drugs. Inhalants, 2 million. Methamphetamine, 1.9 million. Heroin, 808,000. And usually what you're going to find in these numbers is you're going to find the most minor stuff, the stuff that's perceived to be least risky, least dangerous, least harmful, is going to be what you're going to see used most commonly. Marijuana. Marijuana is thought to be a serious drug than a lot of these other drugs, less harmful, less risky, more acceptable to use. And so not surprisingly, a lot more people use it. Same thing, even more so if we were talking about alcohol. Perceived not to be particularly risky or harmful or dangerous, not to have, perceived as not having a lot of negative health consequences. And so you see a lot, and socially acceptable, and so you see a lot of alcohol use. On the extreme opposite end, you see heroin as being rarely used as a percent of the population. People think it's dangerous. They tend to think it's dangerous. They think it's risky. They sense the danger from overdoses. They know that some people overdose from this. I think drugs where they're typically injected into veins are also, that's kind of seen as being risky and dangerous, or more of a health, kind of a potential health problem when you're using needles, that kind of stuff. So a lot of the frequency of drug use depends on how harmful or dangerous or risky it's perceived to be. Next slide. If we look at drug usership among the same population, so basically teenagers and adults, and this is just, again, looking at percentages as opposed to absolute numbers. And you can see down at the bottom here, the blue is for ever used in their lifetime, ever used it. The green is used in the last year, and then we're getting a little closer to regular users when they've used at least in the last month, the gray bar there. So you can see marijuana, again, by far most popular, most commonly used drug. 46% have tried it at least once. I'm going to round here, 18% in the past year, 12% monthly, at least monthly. So you've got a significant part of the population, not far from being a majority, but you got 12% of the population, roughly speaking, who use marijuana, what we could call maybe somewhat regularly. That number has gone up, as we'll see when we get into things more specifically. Cocaine, 14% have ever tried it. 1.9% in the past year, 0.7% in the past month. See, so again, perceived as a riskier drug, used less often by fewer people. LSD, 10% ever, 1% last year, 0.2% in the past month. Ecstasy, again, we'll get into the details of the drugs later on. Let's just introduce some of these numbers now. 7%, 7.4% ever tried, 0.9% last year, 0.2% last month. Meth, 5.6% ever tried, 0.9% last year, 0.6% past month. So again, seen as being risky and a dangerous and a hardcore drug, fewer people trying it, especially more regularly. And heroin being the least common, 2.3% ever, 0.3% last year, 0.2% last month. So it follows, it's a pretty strong rule, almost like a law, a social law that you can bet on, that the more risky the drug or the more hardcore it seems, the fewer people who are going to have ever tried it, the fewer people who are going to use it regularly. And let's see, this is in terms of age. There's a lot of numbers here. And what you all want to do when you're reading a graph is to try to distill what matters more and what matters not so much. So you've got here age. So this is everybody, 12 or older. This is basically teenagers here, 12 to 17. This is older teenagers, young adults, 18 to 25, and then the rest of your adult population, the majority of the people here. And this tells you kind of what's the frequency or the percent of people in these different age groups who are using various drugs. And what I would want to take away from this graph, the main thing is, well, what age group is using the most, right? Which is the most active in terms of drug use from these different types. And if we were to go, here's heroin, we look across, we don't really see big differences here. Perhaps these are such small numbers, it's hard to tell, but perhaps your 18 to 25s might be the highest, the group that has the highest percentage. It's still a small percentage, but a little higher than younger and older folks. So maybe their 18 to 25 might be the key age, the age with the highest rates. But we see as we move down, the cocaine sort of confirms that. If you look at the different age groups, again, here we see the highest number, 1.6 at 18 to 25. Do we find the same thing with hallucinogens? And these are, by the way, the definition here is current users, right? Current users. Of course, it's 2016, but the patterns for age tend to persist year to year. That's why I'm not so worried about the fact that it's older data. Okay, hallucinogens, 18 to 25's got the highest percent. Methamphetamines, well, maybe a little bit higher rate for 26 and older. Finally, finish up with the most common one, marijuana, 20.8%, clearly the highest percentage among 18 to 25. So what I take away, the big story, the number one story I take away from this graph is that 18 to 25-year-olds, so think college age, basically, if you want to kind of put a label on it, college age Americans are most likely overall to be consuming drugs, illegal or problematic, drugs here. So that's a good thing to know. That what you seem to see here is lower rates for younger kids, peak rates for 18, 25, and then 26 and older adults tend to, if they were using it, was most likely during the college ages, and they're most likely to discontinue, to stop, or reduce their drug use as they get older. And actually, this is similar since this is a criminology class here. This is a similar curve that you see with criminal behavior, with violence or theft, etc. With other, or we could say other sorts of criminal behavior, other sorts of illegal behavior, is that it does usually peaks in the late teens and perhaps early 20s, depending on which crime you're talking about. So this drug use, this illicit drug use pattern, pretty much, roughly speaking, parallels what we see with theft, what we see with violence, other sorts of criminal behavior. Good to know. Okay, finally, I think this is the, well, I guess we got a couple more here. But what I wanted to show from this chart is you see it's just an interesting thing that you, well, there are two things I would say. The red are 8th graders, blues 12th graders, green is 10th graders. And so you see 12th graders are the most likely to have, and this is over from 1976 going back a long ways up to 2022. And you see that 12th graders most likely to use, 8th graders the least likely to use, that rates that they didn't follow younger kids back in the 70s. But if you just look at seniors, you can see that and by the way, this is cut off a little bit, but this is marijuana. So marijuana gives us kind of an overall, a big picture use of a common illegal drug and trends. And you can see that this was much more common in the 70s and peaked around 79, late 70s, where you had more than half of seniors using marijuana. And then that dropped a lot in the 80s, dropped significantly, real declines in the 80s. And then it popped back up in the 90s and has kind of wandered up and down in the past couple of decades. But an interesting thing that you see during what's going on here, you see drops in everything. And 20, 21, 22, drops here, drops here, drops here. Actually, there's two questions that occur to me, which are food for thought, which is why this huge drop. Well, first of all, why this huge increase in the second half of the 70s? You get a big mountain here, spike. Then you get this long on through the 80s to the early 90s. You get this big drop, and then an increase back up in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, and then since then it's sort of bounced around. But the final really noteworthy trend is this big drop here in 20, 21, 22. What's going on there? Now, I'm tempted to just kind of leave it to food for thought for you. Let me do that. Let me not answer it for you. Again, I like these sort of questions that put it on you as to play the role of the criminologist and try to figure out what the heck's going on. So I'll leave it to you to try to explain why the big increase in late 70s, big decrease in the 80s, and then back up in the 90s. That's where you see the most dynamic shift, right? That requires an explanation. Can you come up with one? I won't tell you. But I can't resist on 20, 21, 22, the big drop during those years. I mean, that's clearly what happened to the country during in 2020. In 2021, we're talking about the pandemic, that the pandemic really shook things up, and we see that a lot of drug use is in the context with parties and spending time with friends. Most people using drugs, sort of recreationally, do it at parties, do it with friends, do it socially. They're less likely to be using on their own by themselves. And so since due to the pandemic, there were fewer parties, there were fewer people getting together and socializing. And when you have less socializing, you have less drug use. That would be my interpretation, and I think it's probably pretty solid. Well, this video is getting a little bit long. Let's wrap it up. You see here that for college, this is just focusing on college students. And I think it's fortunate that this graph has included alcohol, because you can see that alcohol is by far, no big surprises here. This just confirms common sense that about 74% of college students have consumed alcohol. I believe that this is like in the past year, at least once had alcohol. And an interesting flip side of that is that you have, let's say very roughly 25%. Studies show that maybe about 20-25% of Americans abstain from alcohol, because college is a very concentrated period of time where people drink. Again, that fits kind of the stereotype because it's based in a certain reality. But even in college time, when a lot of people drink, you've got like a quarter, to speak roughly, of people that just are abstainers who don't drink. And that's a statistic that probably not everybody's aware of, that you do have a substantial minority of people say 20%. I've seen in other studies. Here we're looking at about 25% of people who don't drink alcohol. Marijuana down at 42.5%, and then these other drugs, of course, less and less common, like we see before. If they're seen as perceived as being heavier, less likely to be used. Adderall, 14.6%, MDMA, 7.2%, cocaine, 7%, LSD, 6.8%, 3.8% for tranquilizers. So it continues to confirm our little quote unquote social law here that the drugs that are seen as riskiest are least likely to be used by people. And I think that's going to wrap it up for us here.